Central Texas. This is Pastor Tim coming to you from Bend and Lomita United Methodist Churches, where we're busy serving God and serving, trying to be faithful to the United Methodist Church, to the tradition of John Wesley, being faithful Orthodox Wesleyan folks who carry on the tradition. We invite you to be part of us. We have worship at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning on Facebook. You can tune in and watch. And if you have a church that's been disaffiliated and you don't want to separate from the Methodist Church, just give us a response on the website or on the Facebook page, and we'll get back to you on that and see what we can do. In the meantime, we're emphasizing the Bible. We think that the Bible is important for the foundation of faith. And so a lot of people, some people don't know what's in the Bible, and it's a very daunting task to begin to read the Bible. That's hard to understand without some help, without somebody giving you a little bit of guidance so that you can come to understand. And you may not have a Bible scholar around you. And so we're going to give you some general ideas about the Bible so you can not be lost when you delve into it. We have begun with the themes of the Bible. You can look back and see some of the great themes of the Bible, and some of the things that we describe are important parts to know what the scriptures say. Then we went back and started doing the parts of the Bible, did the Torah, the basic scriptures of the Hebrew Bible, the first 5 books, and then talked about the prophets and the histories and the poetry and the wisdom literature, so that you can get a guide to what it is that's in the Old Testament. Then we moved on to the New Testament, to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Gospels meaning good news. And they're describing the life and times of Jesus Christ, who he was and what he did, what difference it makes to us. Then we moved on to the story of the church, which is Acts of the Apostles, which is really Luke chapter 2. They wrote about what Paul and Peter did in the early church and how they made decisions and how the church was shaped. And how to relate to other citizens and to relate to the government, how to carry on the business of the church, and who is qualified to be in leadership. You can go back and look at any of those podcasts that are on Facebook. You can find them under Bend United Methodist Church in Texas. Don't put just Bend, because that'll give you a church in Oregon. But we're a little bit different than that, a little bit different landscape. But today we're going to talk about introduction to the letters of Paul and to the other letters of the New Testament. The largest part of the Bible, the New Testament anyway, are letters. Letters were an important part of communication. They didn't have newspapers. They didn't have telegraphs. They didn't have other ways of communicating. And so people sent letters back and forth. Had a very formal structure of greeting and thanksgiving and prayers that the Christians use in their form. There's actually 21 letters written in the New Testament. Some are written by Paul. That's the Romans through Philemon. And then had some non-Paul letters that were from Hebrews to Jude. Now, most of the letters that Paul wrote are in response to a letter that he's received. And so there's a controversy, there's a problem, there's something that they need Paul's help with. And he answers that letter and tries to express himself and express the Christian faith in such a way to build unity and to keep off division. And so it's a little bit like listening to just one half of an argument. If you ever listen to a phone conversation that somebody is having, you can't hear what the other person is saying. That's what it seems like with Paul. So we can reconstruct some of the problems, and experts have tried to do that to understand why he wrote what he did. But the most of the time he's a church builder. He had relationship with many of the churches. Some of them he didn't, and so like Rome, he was writing to them to introduce himself because he was going to go there on his way to Spain, and he would want support from the Roman church. But it's because he didn't know the people, it tends to be more systematic and more complete in the discussion. With the Corinthians, he knew them. And so he responds to some of their complaints and some of their problems and deals rather bluntly at times with telling them how to act and how to deal with each other in the Christian church. So Paul's letters are oftentimes controversial or from a controversy. Some of the letters that Paul is attributed as the author are questioned. Part of the reason that is because in the literary world, they can study the style of writing, they can study the vocabulary, they can theologians study the ideas, and say they just don't quite jive with Paul. But they had a different way of writing, a different sense of authorship. If Paul had a group of people that were following him and he was teaching them about the Christian faith and teaching them about writing, if he was no longer there, if he was out on a mission trip, they might respond to a letter, write a letter and assume that they know enough about Paul to say how he would write it. And so that would be a different vocabulary and a different structure. That doesn't make them any less scripture. That doesn't make them any less true. Part of the way that they gathered the letters was that one church would get a letter from Paul, and then somebody else would probably come by and they showed them the letter, and they said, well, we need a copy of that for our church. And so they would copy the letter and take it with them, and some began to collect the letters of Paul and said this was good to read and worship, that they were helpful. And so they found the letters of Paul to be instructive and dealt with a lot of problems that they were dealing with. And so they saved them, and bunches of letters were saved and then ended up making it in the Bible because they were so important to receive guidance for being the church. Some of the letters were written, especially the non-Paul letters, were written as general letters. They were written to all the churches, and nobody in particular. And then a few of the letters were written to individuals. So you can see, like the letter to Timothy, he wrote that to a very specific person who was too young and feeling very vulnerable and not worthy, and so he had to address that issue. So some of the letters were written to individuals. So we read the background stories so that we can better understand what Paul's thinking was. I'm not here to describe what Paul's theology was as much as describe the letters that he wrote and the effect that they had on the early church. So if you want to read some of the letters, go beyond the Gospels and see what the church leaders were saying and doing in trying to guide the church through a very tumultuous time of persecution and rejection from the Jewish faith. So I recommend them to you. You don't have to understand them all. You don't have to agree with them all, but just put it on the back burner and say, I'll come to that again later when I can have a greater understanding, and discuss them with somebody else. It's always better when you discuss scriptures, especially scriptures you don't understand, and get their perspective, and that way together you can find a fuller explanation, and look at commentaries. Commentaries are great in terms of giving you the background and telling you some of the issues that they're dealing with that you might not understand. It's kind of hard sometimes from 2,000 years later to understand what they're arguing about, why it's so important. But some commentaries can help you do that. Okay, well, we'll see you next time.